There are Jewish conspiracy theories all over the internet. There are Jewish conspiracy theories in every direction, and they go so hard in so many directions, and this is in no way intended to condone or endorse other people's theories or whatever it is they do, okay? I am very intentionally constructing a very thought-out discussion of organized crime here tonight that is supposed to be self-contained within it. Because anytime that you generalize across an entire group, you're wrong. You know, if you generalize all white people are one way, you're wrong. If you generalize all women are one way, you're wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? There are, characteristics, like women are some ways, men are some ways, We're all different ways based upon who we are. But that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is organized crime. And organized crime, ever since the founding of organized crime, has formed into groupings, right? Think about every organized criminal organization you've ever heard of. The Italian Mafia, the Jewish mob, the Irish mob, the Russian Bratva, the cartels, Yakuza, Cosa Nostra, etc. What do all of them have in common? They are racially or ethnically divided, right? Because that is how organized crime has always worked. And it works that way for a very obvious reason. Suppose we were going to run a global pedophile ring together, you and me. If you're super similar to me, and we grew up together, we have the same family, we'll die for each other, right? We could keep a secret, right? But if I've never met you, and you're like different skin color than me, come from a different religion than me, have no connection to my family, I don't know you, like screw you, I'm ratting you out, and I'm taking the money and running. And that's just the most obvious thing you could ever, duh. If that's not obvious to you, don't ever get into organized crime, because you'll be getting into prison. So, they all figured that out centuries ago, and it's been like that ever since the beginning of time. And that's also just how societies form. Like, we form into groupings of like people because humans are always kind of othering in a certain way. And, in this modern world, we're working on doing less othering and more, crossing boundaries and understanding and being kind to other people. But in America, for the most part, I'm going to overgeneralize and say there's kind of a big three of organized crime as well. There are black gangs, is kind of what they get called, right? And there's all kinds of different gangs, gangsters. There's the Jewish mob or the Jewish mafia. They usually get called the Jewish mob in America historically. And then there's the Italian mafia. And you've heard of all three, right? And some you hear about more than others. And these days, we definitely hear about black gangsters way more than everyone else, right? Because these days, the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob don't even exist anymore. They're gone. Don't even worry about them. But you have seen a lot of movies about the Italian mafia, right? So you all know about the Italian mafia, right? Probably seen The Godfather, whatever it is. Tons of movies about the Italian mafia. You've seen tons of gangster movies, all about the Bloods and the Crips, black people shooting each other, whatever. But how many of you have seen any movies about the Jewish mob? There are some. There's a few, maybe. So, that's not because the Jewish mob doesn't exist. The Jewish mob is very well documented historically speaking, and they were around at the exact same time as the mafia came around when we decided to outlaw booze that everyone was drinking. And the organized criminal elements existed before Prohibition, but Prohibition turned it into a syndicate, all around the country. And it did that for the Italians, did that for the Russians, did that for the Jewish people, did that for every single, denomination of people that had any inclination to make money at the time, because it was worth a lot of money to get into the liquor business. And the guys that came out on top were the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia. And there was a lot of other people of other ethnicities in there, and people in the mafia were sometimes not Italian if they were very trustworthy, right? Same with the Jewish mob. But you can see what I mean, where someone's ethnicity is relevant, right? If you have a whole town overrun by the Italian mafia, and then an Italian walks into your shop carrying a gun, you're probably going to judge the situation very differently than if, a black person walks into your shop with a gun. And maybe it's all going to suck, because maybe they're, who knows what they're going to do. But their affiliations matter, right? And at first, the Jewish mob was different than the Italian mafia. At first, they were very much their own kind of clans doing their own thing. We already talked a little bit last talk about how Meyer Lansky in the middle there, who was in the Jewish mob, he is Jewish, he kind of realized that, like, guys, we should probably work together and we can get a lot more done. And they came together and formed a thing called Murder Inc., which was essentially the combining of the mafia and the mob for shared goals. And they still fought a lot. They still, because different ethnicities get it, whatever. But that was real. And that was happening. 20s, 30s, 40s, and into 50s, into World War II. And we're going to come back to them in just a second, because during World War II, there was this thing happening across the ocean. And they'd been trying to found Israel for a long time, right? And starting in the 20s, and then through about 1950, there were all these paramilitary groups operating in mandatory Palestine. So Palestine, and what is now Palestine and Israel, at that time was just a British colony called Mandatory Palestine, right? And this is not controversial history. Like, I intentionally am using Wikipedia screenshots because, like, Israel has a whole army of Wikipedia editors specifically to make sure that Wikipedia is legit. And, like, Wikipedia is very much a controlled, safe space for safe information. And you can go deeper and you can check their sources. But I'm intentionally just using very basic history that's not complicated. Because at the time, during that founding of Israel, there were all of these Zionist paramilitary groups kind of going about the founding of Israel in their own ways that they thought were right? And the Haganah was sort of the most mainstream one, and they engaged in violence in a way that felt like more balanced than a lot of the other ones. And I'm not saying Palestinians did not engage in violence. I'm not an expert. What I am saying is that the Lehi group and the Irgun engaged in a lot of violence at the time. A lot of violence. So much violence, let me skip to the next one, that the government of Israel, as soon as it was formed, labeled them both as domestic terror organizations, even though they had helped found Israel. But they had done it by bombing civilian infrastructure, specifically to bomb civilians to make the place uninhabitable so that people would leave. And so they could fill it with more Zionists. And it was highly controversial. And the entire Jewish world, for the most part, except for, them and the mob, condemned what they were doing and called them terrorists. And eventually they were forced to disband and stop. And so what they did is they disbanded and became the IDF. And that is very literally their official history. You can read it on Wikipedia. You can read it in a history book. These terrorist organizations all disbanded. And like the IDF said, you must disband and stop doing what you're doing, stop doing the terrorist stuff, and then come be a part of the IDF. And so clearly, they joined the IDF, and they never bombed civilians again. And I'm not just running through this to give you a history of Israel, because in order to bomb people and to commit violence, in order to go to essentially what is a miniature war, you need weapons. And all of those weapons were coming from these guys back in the United States, because the US had just finished fighting World War II, or was kind of in the process of winding down, and we had all these surplus weapons. And the Jewish mob in the US was smuggling all of those surplus weapons over to Israel to arm the Haganah primarily, but all of the other paramilitary groups as well, to fight that war against those Palestinians in order to create Israel. So the mob was running arms. And I'm not doing this to dunk on Israel. I'm doing this to express the fact that the organized crime syndicates that formed the mafia and the mob were global, and they were trafficking weapons, and they were forming close alliances with young fighters in the IDF, right? At the time they were in the Irgun, right? They would go on to be in the IDF, or to have kids that would buy the UFC. That's a true story. Ari Emanuel, look him up. He had a character in Entourage. His dad was one of those terrorists in the Irgun. His brother then went on to work for Obama in the White House. His other brother was on Biden's COVID task force. The Lehi group, not the Irgun, but the one with the two fingers, the hand, the Lehi group, often known as the Stern Gang, during World War II, they were convinced that it was best to work with the Nazis. That was kind of the split between Lehi and Irgun in some ways, was that Irgun thought we should work with the Allies. They will be more beneficial for Israel getting formed. And the Lehi group, the Stern Gang, was like, nah, these Nazis are really going to get the job done. And so they wanted to work with the Nazis and the Axis powers to get it done. So During World War II, it's kind of while all this is happening, the way they facilitated all that smuggling of all those weapons, and we talked about this a little bit last night, is there was like all these bombings happening on the ports, the eastern seaboard of the United States, that may or may not have had something to do with the mafia and the mob. You know, there was problems with the security at the ports. And the ports were all run by all of the union workers that were all members of the mafia and the mob. And so the United States government couldn't really get a handle on their port security. And during a war, securing your border, securing your port is really important. And so the solution was to go to the mafia and the mob and say, bro, can you please secure our ports for us? And they basically hired the mob and the mafia to run the entire eastern seaboard, officially. So, during World War II, Operation Underworld gave control over every port on the eastern seaboard of the United States of America to the organized crime of the mob and the mafia, named Crime Inc., run by these gentlemen. And through those ports, they started to run a whole bunch of weapons over to their buddies. And they were also importing a whole bunch of drugs and doing all sorts of other stuff, because ports do things. But then they all started to get old, and they all started to die, and they all went to jail because law enforcement started to do their job. And so they're all gone, and you never hear about them anymore because the mafia and the mob pretty much shut down. And now it's just a whole bunch of black people causing trouble, at least in America. Maybe. We'll get to that. But a whole bunch of them went over to Israel. And there's actually plenty of very documentable evidence of very strong organized crime families and networks and syndicates in Israel right now. As just one example, in 2010, WikiLeaks leaked a cable about the U.S. Embassy in Israel being highly concerned about the level that organized crime was coming to in Israel, right? We like to think of Israel as this like, it is a country. It is very complex. There are good people there. There are bad people there. It's a whole country, right? And they have a complicated history. It's fresh off of a whole bunch of war, a whole bunch of religious persecution, all kinds of stuff. And all these people that spent the last, 40 years fighting this war, getting called terrorists, a lot of them still live there. And a lot of them are still involved in these organized crime networks. And I am not saying, for y'all on the internet, that all Jewish people are in organized crime networks. What I'm saying is that organized crime networks can happen anywhere. And when you see something that walks like an organized crime network and talks like an organized crime network, you probably have Jeffrey Epstein smuggling kids. So let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein. If you're not clear by now, Jeffrey Epstein worked for Israel. He was Mossad. He did not work for the CIA. He was not an American asset. He worked with the CIA because the CIA and Mossad have been joined at the hip ever since the CIA was founded and realized that they had no idea what they were doing, and Mossad was way better at their job than them. And they had a buddy that was like halfway in Mossad anyways, who could just walk on over there and get some help getting the information and come on back. Mr. Angleton, who is buried in this state. Yeah, he's from Boise. So Jeffrey Epstein, he was really good friends with Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel. But not necessarily because Ehud Barak was doing kid stuff, right? There are certain people in Epstein's networks that are partners, collaborators, other operatives. And then there are certain people in Epstein's network that are targets, that are using his services, so to speak, right? And sometimes it's obvious which is which, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes people are both, and we kind of have to speculate, right? Because if only the US government had evidence at their disposal, then maybe they could answer all of this, but they don't have any tapes or any evidence, and so unfortunately, we're just left to speculate. So that's what we'll do, right? And I'm going to briefly run you through why I'm saying he was Mossad and he was Israel. And if you have not done the research, it might be controversial to think that. Read Whitney Webb's books. She will lay it out in no uncertain terms, but I'll just run you through some of the basics, right? Jeffrey Epstein was an unqualified math teacher at a college where he was famous for going to student parties and getting really handsy with his students. And by unqualified, I mean like he had no qualifications to be a math teacher, but he was teaching math at this college. And from that college, where he was famous for going to parties and being handsy with his students, he got plucked out to go and work at Bear Stearns by this guy named Ace Greenberg, right? Ace Greenberg decided that this math teacher that is kind of like, he's smart, don't get me wrong, Epstein is smart, but he He's controversial. He's doing his thing. Gets plucked out by Ace Greenberg and promoted into doing investment banking, right? And this is the part of his story where it kind of gets, he said to Robert Kennedy Jr. at one point that then some Chinese people approached him and asked him to hunt some money down, and who knows? But all we know is that he went from working at Bear Stearns for Ace Greenberg to Lex Wexner at The Limited, who runs Victoria's Secret. And suddenly he goes from being a math teacher who's trying to get handsy with his students to hop, and he's managing billions and billions and billions of dollars for one of the biggest companies in the world, right? And then along the way, he gets linked up with Robert Maxwell, one of the most famous Mossad spies of all time, who has a daughter who is now Epstein's handler in this new operation that he just happens to run, right? And again, so here's the connection where conspiracy theories get complicated, right? All of those men are Jewish, right? And that is not to say that all Jewish people are bad, or that all Jewish people would ever have anything to do with this kind of thing. What that is to say is that when you're looking at, you know he's an organized crime lord, right? He runs one of the biggest blackmail sex operations in the world. And when you look at every single person that's associated with him on his rise to the top, and they all share one ethnic background, that would be like finding like Mr. Genovese, and a whole bunch of Italians made Mr. Genovese get to where he has this Tommy gun store, and he's selling Tommy guns all over LA. And it's like, that kind of looks like a mafia operation to me. And maybe that's racist, I don't know. But it doesn't end there. This is just 3 examples. And you can go deeper down that rabbit hole if you want. But suffice it to say that I am very convinced, and if you do more research, I think you will be too, that Jeffrey Epstein represents the Mossad. So, our boy Hunter, let's come back to it, right? Hunter had these laptops. We briefly touched on them earlier. But what were they actually trying to cover up, right? Like, the first layer of the story is they were trying to cover up the problem with the election. Like, if this laptop gets out, it's going to mess up the whole election. And it's a fake laptop, so stop that. But what if there was actually more behind that? What if it was not just the laptop, right? We know that Hunter Biden has been compromised his entire life. He's a crackhead. He's running around the whole world filming himself doing all kinds of horrifying sex acts with underage girls, with overage girls, with relatives, with his own dead brother's wife. So, and we'll come back to her, don't worry. But all those laptops are out on the internet. He's a crackhead. You know, he is, so in the background, I've spared you from it. I've just given you one little snapshot of Hunter Biden in the scarf. If you've seen the photo, you've seen the photo. And I've spared you from all of the horrifyingly gross other photos that you can find at bidenlaptopmedia.com if you want to see them. And the darkest thing about it is that when you get a photo in your phone's album and you want to look at it later, like when I'm making content and I want to make a video later, you duplicate the image, right? So it comes back down to the bottom of your camera roll. Do you understand what I mean? And it's very clear in his camera roll that he has duplicated the photos of his young child niece in her swimsuit over and over and over and over and over. And they reappear in blocks all throughout his camera roll. So, don't go look, because it's really sad. But all that's on the internet, right? 50-something-year-old crackhead, literally. And you can see the photos of him smoking crack, too. But that woman, Melissa Cohen, she's like, that is my guy, I want him. This like young, pretty Jewish woman picks him out of a crowd and marries him the week she meets him and gets matching shalom tattoos with him, right? Which maybe is true. Like, maybe that happens. I don't know. He is a Biden. He is powerful. That could be. But she wasn't just ignoring the fact that he was a crackhead and all that. She was also ignoring the fact that he had also already had an affair with the wife of his brother after his brother had died. But the wife of his brother was also a Jewish woman who had entered the family and had married his brother, the more successful brother, right? The kind of brother that if you were controlling the Biden family, you would want to control that older brother who was successful and smart, right? But then he died, right? And no sooner does he die than Haley Oliver suddenly jumps and starts having sex with his crackhead brother. That's kind of weird. At the very least, that's a very degenerate, horrible choice with her life. But to me, it looks a little bit more like what I would do if I was trying to like be an asset and run a family, right? And I'm not saying I know that for sure. I'm saying that as a data point. And the more data points in the Biden family that add up to Israel controlling the Biden family, the more they all start to look like data points of Israel controlling the Biden family. Because it's kind of weird to marry a crackhead 1 week after meeting him when there are photos of him having sex with whores all over the internet for everyone to see. Especially when, like, she could go marry better people if she wanted, right? Similar situation, like, why are you doing this, right? Why are you getting with the crackhead when you were just with his brother? And she has kids with his brother, right? So, then it's not just sexual stuff. Joe Biden is the highest paid recipient of pro-Israel money in all of American congressional history, right? So this is from opensecrets.org, where you can look up Israel's lobbying money to U.S. senators and congressmen, et cetera. And Joe Biden, across his Senate career, received a total of $5.9 million. I think the next highest on there is 2.5. Oh, and then there's Hillary with 2.3. So, Joe has received millions of dollars from Israeli PACs. His whole family is full of strange sexual stuff with Jewish women. And his son, his last living son, is the most blackmailable person on the entire planet, right? And when you start to actually watch through some of the videos where there's videos where he's talking to these women and talking about his life and about what's going on. And in those videos, you can start to piece together that what he's saying is that people have told him to make blackmail. It's like, they wanted me to make this one, like I was supposed to do. He's actively filming blackmail on himself, presumably because of blackmail. It's not really super clear, right? And so if you were an old man, 80 years old or whatever, you're on your way out, and you had one son, what's the most important thing in your life? It's probably that son. It might be the rest of your family too, but that son is pretty high on that list, right? And so you have to think about the level of blackmailability when that dude's son is all over the internet wearing a scarf and some whitey tighties and smoking crack, okay? So, there are all kinds of questions about this family. And it's important to remember that we have a known sexual blackmail ring that is operating child sexual blackmail in high political circles in the White House, right? Bill Clinton was one of the most prolific clients of Jeffrey Epstein. And we know that for a fact. And Hillary didn't go anywhere. Hillary is still right there. At least to Bill Gates' wife, Melinda Gates' credit, she left. She got the hell out of there, right? And hopefully she slammed the door. But Hillary didn't go anywhere. Has anyone ever thought about that? Not only did Hillary not go anywhere, she ran for president. Not only did she run for president, all their buddies came out to support. Isn't that kind of weird? Wasn't there a question about some Pizzagate stuff earlier? It's like $65,000 worth of hot dogs getting flown to the White House using the same channels or something? I don't know. Look it up for yourself. And so, then you look at Bill Clinton, who is known to be, flying around with Jeffrey Epstein with this Mossad operative sexual blackmail network, right? And then what's the scandal that hits Bill Clinton? I hate to say it, but Monica Lewinsky was a Jewish woman that was doing sexual stuff in the White House with him, right? And if you've got a guy blackmailed and currently are going through these peace talks over in Israel trying to arrange the borders between Israel and Palestine, and he's not exactly doing what you want, what do? You'd be like, well, here's a story news. We've been doing it all along. You've been having sex with our people all along. We've got video of it all. We know all about it. Suddenly there's a story on the internet, right? And I'm not saying I know that she was Mossad. I'm saying that I'm seeing a pattern, right? And if you were operating those kinds of blackmail rings, these are the kinds of patterns that you would start to see. Okay? And so if you were concerned about if our nation was being infiltrated by Israel, by Mossad, like we know, for example, that Jeffrey Epstein is targeting the President of the United States of America, right? So there's a thing where like people get on this like, oh, it's a Jewish conspiracy theory. You're trying to say all Jews are bad. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm saying that the president of the United States of America was screwing kids with a Mossad operative. I've got concerns, right? And so my first operation order of business, because it's not just him, suddenly our new president has all these other red flags. And maybe they're all nothing, but we should probably be asking some questions, right? And so when you start asking those questions, you're like, holy moly, that's a lot of Jewish people in our highest levels of office, in the cabinet, right? And imagine that they all are just regular people. They have nothing to do with Israel or Mossad, right? They're Jewish, so maybe they're stoked on Israel, but they have nothing to do with Mossad, right? And they get elected into office, and that's cool. But imagine that you are Mossad, and you wanted to infiltrate America, just like you did with Bill Clinton when you had him go and have sex with kids. Who are you going to approach? Probably the Jewish people, because they already support Israel, right? They already have a bond with you. If you're the mafia and you want to infiltrate a government, you're going to look for an Italian. Obviously. That's how organized crime works. You go and you find someone with whom you have a bond, and you be like, and you don't even necessarily tell them. You're like, hey man, like, I'm with Israel. I know you love us. We love you. We're just trying to work out this really great deal. And if you could be our voice in the cabinet, that would be great. Obviously nothing illegal. I'm just a voice in the cabinet. We both want to work together. It's like, no problem, right? Why would they even say no to that? If any one of those people was actually compromised by Mossad, that would be a huge problem for our government, let alone if multiple of them were, right? Just so we're clear, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, one of the most powerful men in the world right now. Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, the most powerful woman in the world right now when it comes to money. Maybe Jerome Powell, who knows? There's other people, but Merrick Garland, Alejandro Mayorkas, Jeff Zients, the White House Chief of Staff, Avril Haines is the National Intelligence Director, so she's like above the Director of the CIA, and then the Deputy Director of the CIA over there, Mr. Cohen, right? And just to be clear, if you look up articles on the timesofisrael.com, which is an Israeli publication, they brag about this. They love, like, Jewish people and Israeli people are so stoked on how many Jewish people are in positions of power all around the world. They write articles about it all day long. Like, the most, like, Jewish conspiracy theory-y things you could ever read come out of Israeli publications, because they will write all day long about how, like, we've got all these people all around the world in all these powerful positions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if they start working with people like Jeffrey Epstein to get Bill Clinton to go and have sex with kids and blackmail our government, for example, right? And it's a good thing that none of those people have ever been caught working with Jeffrey Epstein. Only the director of the CIA has been caught with Jeffrey Epstein. William J. Burns is not Jewish, right? All the other ones are Jewish, but William J. Burns is actually not. But he was the ambassador to Russia for a long time. He worked in the government his whole life. He's a very accomplished diplomat. And he finishes his long, accomplished career as a diplomat, and at the end, he's there in Russia. And he needs a new job after he's been the ambassador to Russia. And so he goes to his good friend, Jeffrey Epstein, and asks his help to get a job. And Jeffrey Epstein helps him get a job as the director of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a globalist think tank organization that advises governments on what to do about the world. And if you don't know, globalist think tank organizations are essentially just intelligence agency, private operative corporations that help them do that whole plausible deniability thing. And so it's kind of weird that a guy that is that connected around the world, that's been a diplomat for that long, needs his buddy Jeffrey to help him get a job, right? And then, after working at that organization for a little while, he gets plucked out to be the director of the CIA. And all of that is while Jeffrey was still free, right? He went down sort of at the end of that storyline. So, that's just me saying that I've got a lot of questions and concerns. And if my government, it's a good thing that my government is not acting in a way that is like overtly pro-Israel, that has unquestioning faith and loyalty to Israel, because if it was, that would be some sure evidence that I would probably have some reasonable concerns. But fortunately, our government is very rational and very reasonable and balanced, and so there's not even any evidence that would make me concerned. So let's talk about the music industry. And this is going to be a theme over and over and over. And the point is that we don't necessarily know in most of these cases, but we do know that the mafia is full of Italians, and we do know that the Yakuza is full of Japanese people, right? I hope I'm not getting my Asian countries wrong. That would be really embarrassing. And we know that the mob was full of Jewish people, but they disbanded, so they don't exist anymore. So recently, there was this lawsuit in the music industry. There's this rapper called Diddy, and if you're much, much older than me, I'm going to give you the speed run. Diddy was like there at the start of gangster rap, right? Like when all the kids started grinding on each other at the high school dances, that was this guy's fault, right? He was the one that was bringing up all those musicians, and he was like at the top of the food chain when the rappers started shooting each other, and all the girls started hoeing on each other, and the guys started, gangster. That was Diddy and his generation of rappers, right? And Diddy recently had a really spicy lawsuit. He was sued by a producer that he had tried to work with on an album called Lil Rob, and the lawsuit is full of evidence. So much evidence. Like so much evidence that they actually included a whole bunch of photos and details in the lawsuit, but then they directly state, which is a legally binding statement if it's in a deposition in a lawsuit, that they have like thousands of pieces of text messages and audio recordings, video and stuff like that. So, in the music industry, we're going to find the same exact pattern when you look above P. Diddy. Do I have more slides about P. Diddy? Cool. I'll give you more about P. Diddy right here. So in that lawsuit, Lucien Grange, who is P. Diddy's boss, is directly named because Lucien Grange, the CEO of Universal Music Group, the biggest music company in the whole world right now, basically, he was the one funding the parties. He was attending the parties. And at those parties, they were spiking drinks that they were serving. So they had bottles for the girls, and there was bottles for the boys, and they were spiking all the bottles for the girls. There were underage girls all over the place. No one knows where they came from. But Lucien Grange was making sure they got brought in mansions filled with cameras. Sound familiar? Right? And so they had these crazy parties, like crazy industry rap parties, where they have young girls and drugs being given to them without their knowledge, and cameras in every room, and celebrities coming in to get filmed, right? Essentially exactly what Jeffrey Epstein was doing, exactly what J. Edgar Hoover was doing, just a new version of it in the rap industry. And this blew the world up. Later, we'll talk about how it actually connects all the way back to Michael Jackson in this crazy way. We'll cover that too. But I started to look at the music industry. It's like, well, Lucien Grange is Jewish, right? And I've heard an awful lot of rappers complaining about the Jewish managers above them treating them wrong, right? And now I'm seeing a sexual blackmail ring with video sexual blackmail. That is the exact signature of the Jewish mob all the way back to J. Edgar Hoover, right? J. Edgar Hoover's blackmail ring, Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail ring, and now Diddy's blackmail ring. We have 3 sexual blackmail rings, and all of them have a Jewish dude in charge, right? And the first one, we know it was the mob, right? And the second one, we pretty much know it was Israel. And so now this third one, and it's just some random Jewish dude in America in the rap industry? So who else is in the music industry? Well, it turns out that the executives of all the music companies in the industry are Jewish, with the exception of maybe Sony, except that Sony, Clive Davis is in charge of this huge portion of Sony, and Clive Davis has been around way back since he was managing Janis Joplin and the Grateful Dead and all sorts of other artists that have been around for ages. These guys have been playing the game for ages. So if you're not clear, Universal Music Group, Lucien Grange, that is 33 out of the top 100 songs last year. Warner Music Group, I don't remember the exact stat, but it's the next third, essentially. And then Sony is basically the other third, right? And then Liar Cohen, just for good measure, he's got YouTube Global Head of Music. And these are just 4 examples. There are many, many, many more. These are just the big boys. Because everywhere you look, you kind of got Jewish executives on top of the music industry. And it is not a secret. Like, I talk to rappers about it, and they're like, well, yeah, that's how it's always worked, Black gangsters on the bottom, Jewish gangsters on the top. Y'all do the dirty work, we'll launder the money. That's how the money laundering has always worked. And it wouldn't necessarily have rung any bells if we didn't already have examples of a whole bunch of rappers blowing the whistle on a bunch of Jewish executives in the music industry, treating them like shit and trying to manipulate them. And when they try to speak up about it, getting treated in really sketchy, weird ways. And if y'all remember what happened to Michael Jackson, we'll go over that in a second here. And if you're familiar with what happened to Kanye West, we'll go over that too, right? So the fact that we have whistleblowers in the industry telling us a thing is true, and then we have lawsuits coming up from in the industry giving us evidence of the exact same thing. And then we have the landscape in terms of the people and places that you would expect to see if those things were true. It's that's an awful lot of angles of corroboration of organized crime active in the space. So when I was looking at the P. Diddy lawsuit, I noticed this dude named Fahim Muhammad. I think it was actually one of my followers, because that's the beauty of decentralized media, is one of my followers was like, hey, that guy was Michael Jackson's head of security too. And when you look it up, he was. And it's crazy. It's crazy. Fahim Muhammad, the dude in the picture, he graduated with a business and marketing degree in 2008. He went on with a business and marketing degree in 2008, 19-year-old kid, became the head of security for the king of pop. And then whoopsies, he died the next year, 2009. True story. You can watch the news footage of Fahim Muhammad on the stand telling us how he was the second one on the scene, right? That's super weird, right? And if you aren't familiar, Michael Jackson had his head of security for like his whole life, had been this dude, I'm pretty sure his name was Bill. There's this crazy emotional letter that he wrote to him you can find on the internet where this guy was like his father because he never really had a real father kind of. And he wrote this like really touching letter to Bill as he was kind of passing on. He retired, but he like worked until he was like 70. And it's very clear that he was like, you're my dad. You're my head of security. Keep me safe. This world is crazy. I am a big, immature child, right? And I'm also the king of pop. And then Bill had to go on, and he started cycling through new security members. And just 2 or 3 years later, he winds up with Fahim, and then he overdoses. So I don't have time to go into it, but when I found that out, I started to dig into all of the allegations of the child stuff with Michael Jackson, and pretty quickly you realize that, like, holy moly, that looks a lot like that was constructed, and you should do that dig for yourself, but it was constructed on top of the name Wacko Jacko, which is a reference to a movie or cartoon of a monkey character, which is like overtly calling the black guy a monkey, and then saying he's like this crazy psychopath and like he wants to be with kids. It's all very complicated and confusing, and he was a weird dude. But do that dig for yourself. All I know is that Fahim has a really good business and marketing degree. And then he did so good at protecting the king of pop that he got promoted to being the head of Diddy's security. And when you're the head, I don't know if you've ever been the head of security for a sexual blackmail ring, but I'll tell you how it works. Your job is to make sure you know where all the drugs and all the guns and all the underage girls are at all times. Otherwise, you're not doing a good job of security for the sexual blackmail ring, right? And there are all kinds of spicy details in that lawsuit describing how Diddy described Fahim as his fixer, as in if you ever get pulled over, you call Fahim, he's got connections with law enforcement, he'll make it go away. Those are direct quotes, right? Every one of Diddy's people was instructed to carry drugs on them at all times so that Diddy could get high at any time, anywhere, because that's the kind of guy Diddy is. And Fahim was the guy that they were instructed, like, if anything goes wrong with that, you call Fahim, he'll take care of it. At one point, Diddy shot a guy in a bathroom. LAPD came up and looked in the bathroom. They were like, that looks like someone got shot in here. And Fahim apparently went and talked to them. They were like, all good. Drive-by shooting, we're out. So Fahim has a really good business and marketing degree. Okay? Now let's talk about Kanye West's whistleblowing. Because remember, we got to Michael Jackson because he had been like, they don't really care about us, Jew me, sue me, right? And they called him an anti-Semite. And he was talking about all the Jewish record executives. He was buying up all of Sony Music. He was coming after them. And he'd seen how they worked his whole life. And he was doing something about it. And he was doing really, really something about it. And then suddenly they all came after him and all this stuff happened. So, interesting. Then we have this guy, Kanye, who kind of likened himself a lot to Michael. And he started to speak out a lot about the Jewish record executives in the music business. Then he gets branded as an anti-Semite and a Nazi. And then he leaks this text message onto the internet that came from his personal trainer, Harley Pac. And if you've never read this, holy moly, sit tight. This is a text from Harley. I'm going to help you one of a couple ways. First, you and I sit down and have a loving and open conversation, but you don't use cuss words, and everything that is discussed is based in fact, not some crazy stuff that dumb friend of yours told you, or you saw in a tweet. Or the second option, I have you institutionalized again, where they medicate the crap out of you, and you go back to zombie land forever. Playdate with the kids just won't be the same. Harley Pac is also Jewish, and he is a personal trainer for the stars. And if you want a fun little rabbit hole, go to harleypasternak.com and just look up how many stars he is a personal trainer for. I think they have scrubbed it from the web ever since it picked up and we all found it, but there is an interview on the internet where Harley Pasternak was being interviewed by some talk show host, and he was asking him what he used to do for the Canadian military, because he used to be Canadian Special Forces. And he used to work in a science task force where his job, in his own words, was to test drugs. And the guy asked him, oh, cool, what kind of drugs? He's like, the kind you've never heard of. And so you understand why they tried to take that video down. I'm sure it's still out there, and I'm sure you can find it, but that's weird, right? So we have whistleblowers, and then the way those whistleblowers are received is, what you would expect if they were right. And then we have lawsuits, and what's in the lawsuit correlates to what we were being told by the whistleblowers, right? And then you look around at the evidence that's publicly available information, and that correlates too. And so I am not saying that Jewish people are bad. Let's remember. I'm saying that looks like organized crime. That looks a lot like organized crime. So now let's talk about APAC. So what we did is we didn't even try to stream on TikTok this time. We just went on Instagram because I don't think they ban you because they don't pay you. We're like, it's not even worth putting this one on TikTok. So APAC, everyone's favorite lobby. If you're not familiar with APAC, you can go to APAC.com. You can look at how much they brag about how every candidate they fund gets elected, right? Every single candidate, 98% of APAC candidates won their general election. They defeated 13 anti-Israel candidates, right? And that's all good because APAC is an American PAC that represents Americans, and it's lobbying on behalf of American interests in American Congress with our American money, right? And so it's a good thing that they can brag about how much money they're spending to influence our politics, to make our politicians do what they want. And they're American because they're not registered under FARA, because the guy that was trying to make them register under FARA was a president at the time and then wound up with his brains all over the back of his car the week that he sent them the forms to register. And that is true. I mean, technically it was like within 3 weeks. And then, as soon as Mr. Kennedy was dead, they sent back a letter saying no thanks. And to this day, they are not registered under FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is what you do when you're a foreign lobby that's giving money to Congress, because it puts a whole bunch of restrictions on you, and it makes so you have to tell us where the money's all coming from, obviously. Because if Iran wants to come in and lobby our government, we're dang well going to know where that money's coming from, and what they're all doing with it, and what's going on, right? But fortunately, Mr. Kennedy's brains are all over the back of his car, and they are not registered, and so they represent American interests, and all the money that they're getting and sending to us is coming from who knows where, because they don't have to report it. Hopefully it's not coming from our taxpayer dollars that we're sending over to Israel because they paid all of our Congress people to send money over to Israel. You see what I'm saying? And this is not new. I'm sure you guys know this. So, all of Congress stands with Israel. Out of 100 senators, only 7 have not had significant campaign contributions from the Israel lobby, right? Went through the whole list. There is data about this. You can go to apactracker.com or you can go to opensecrets.com. There are lots of resources about this as we have started to realize this since October 7th. And out of 100 senators, these are the only 7 that have not taken campaign contributions. And what do I mean by campaign contributions? It means if I'm running for office in this spot, I need money to win, right? And maybe I'm running against someone who's a total loser, and I'm probably going to win. So maybe I just need a little bit just to make sure I win, right? But maybe I'm running against a total stud, like Mark is running against me, and I need all the help in the world. Then I need all the money, right? So the amount of money you receive is more related to the tightness of the race and the stakes of the race. But if 2 Zionists are running against each other, APAC doesn't really care, right? They might care, but... So these 7 have not received any money from any Israel lobby at all. But actually, 3 of them are extremely pro-Israel, and they just didn't need any money. And LaFonza Butler got shooed in as a replacement on one thing. She's in her first term, and no one really knows anything about her, is my understanding. So they didn't even have a time to give her any money. So we'll see next term. And Mazie and Rand and Bernie have much more complex stances that are not necessarily exactly pro-Israel. So out of 100 senators, we'll be generous and say that 4 of them are not either completely obviously pro-Israel or paid to be pro-Israel, right? Because if I paid for you to get your Congress seat, that Congress seat is how you get to go and have those parties on that island with those kids, or it's how you get to go and get all that money from the other donor groups. It's how you get to go to that party where you meet the billionaire that's going to give you the contributions. That's how that's how Alejandra Ocasio, AOC, that gal, that's how she went from tending the bar to having $46 million or whatever in 4 years, is because having those seats is really, 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 really valuable, right? So, out of 100, 4 is not a great number. So let's return back to our organized crime. Out of the big 3, the black gangs, the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia, in our current society, you only ever see 1, right? There is no more mafia. There is no more mob in America, officially, right? They've faded out of existence, and now we just have all of these black gangs, right? And you hear about them in all the music. You see them in all the movies. They're everywhere. Black gangs everywhere. And I just want to remind us about the music industry, about Hollywood, about these people that are promoting the black gangsters in the first place. Because we didn't quite talk about the fact that Diddy has this lawsuit, Diddy's doing the sexual blackmail thing, but there's another layer where Diddy, all throughout his career, has been the one sort of selecting and promoting artists. And a lot of them he's been selecting and promoting, we know from his lawsuit directly, and from a whole, but I mean, the rap industry loves to gossip. And he's been promoting people based upon whether they will do gay stuff with him. He's been promoting people based upon whether he can control them through other blackmailed means. And actually, he's promoting them based upon if they do not have talent. And the reason why Diddy would promote people if they did not have talent is because it's far easier to control someone who has no talent. Because if you do not have talent and I give you a record deal, I own all the, like Lucien Grange owns half the music label, he owns the media, the magazines, the radio stations, so it's like no problem to get your music everywhere. The problem is once you want to, say something about it. That's the problem, right? And so they have the ability to promote kind of anyone, as long as, you'll shake your butt on stage or you'll wiggle your chain and play with a gun. And so they would actually prefer to promote people with no talent, because then if you don't do what I want you to, I'll just take your spot away. And then you have nothing, right? You're immediately trash again. Whereas if you promote Kanye can just go make his own music. He doesn't need you, right? And if Kanye were to get kicked out, which he kind of did, he'd just go make his own album and it would do real good, right? And so they started to realize that actually promoting talent is really dangerous. And you don't want to promote talent. You want to control talent. And the talent is the people that wind up in these kinds of photos having those kinds of stories. Because when talent gets problematic, you have to do way more than just pull their record contract. And if you take that exact same idea and you look at the other industries out there, like Hollywood, for example, or like music, like media, the job that I'm in now, the same is true there too, right? So, the rap industry has been promoting degeneracy and gangsterism, right? And all the things that look like black people are the organized crime in America today. Unbeknownst to all of us, that's being perpetrated by a large organized crime syndicate right behind them that are tied into all these other networks. And maybe they're not, I don't know. Maybe all of the Jewish people in the music industry are doing super shady, sketchy stuff with sexual blackmail rings in the music industry, and they are not in any way communicating with the people that are doing the sexual blackmail industry and the politics. That could be, but that would be super weird, right? And they're using the same tactics. They both have rooms wired up full of cameras, right? And maybe none of them are communicating with the giant country that wants to, do everything they possibly can to forward their own interests, including the fact that their prime minister was a good buddy with Epstein. And so you see what I'm saying is all of the pieces are there. And it's not about being Jewish. It's not about being Israeli. It's about acting like an organized crime syndicate. And organized crime syndicates have always grouped around ethnic relationships, because that is the strongest tie that binds, right? If you are all in the same religion, that is a far deeper way to trust each other. And if you all have the same interests in this country, that is the last hope for your religion, that is an extremely strong religious personal motivation to adhere to your group's unit, right? And once again, to remind us all that I'm not saying that every Israeli thinks that way. I'm saying that the ones that chose to be organized crime POSs also think that way, because that is part of a group identity. So, the solution. This one kind of came out of our podcast today, actually. In a lot of ways, God is the solution. And I don't mean this necessarily in a nationalist or I mean this very literally, regardless of your religion, regardless of your faith, God represents truth. God represents the rightness in this world. God represents the voice that tells you what's right. Even if you're not religious, that's still what God represents. God is righteousness, right? And we all know what it looks like. And it does not look like whatever the heck that whole presentation was about. There is no human on this planet that would look at what all those people are doing and think that is God, right? That is clearly the devil. That is clearly Satan. That is clearly the most evil forces that are possible in this world. Whatever your religion calls it, that was all that. And the answer is that everyone knows in their heart when they're witnessing truth and love and goodness, right? And so following that, fearlessly following that, seeking the truth, seeking righteousness, standing up for it, talking about it, and not being afraid of what anyone will call you. Because anyone that's going to call you a name for defending a bunch of pedophiles is not someone I care about their opinion, right? Right? So, that's as much of an upper as I can end on there, right? Evil is very real in this world. But fortunately, you're in a room surrounded by everyone that stands for righteousness, right? You're in a room full of God, right? I want one more round of applause for Mark putting this all together, for pounding this space for us. Because if Mark is anything, he is those three things at the bottom, right? And when you find people that do those things, you stay with them, you work with them, you build them up, and you follow their example. And then as you do more of that, someone else will see you do it, and they'll follow your example, right? Righteousness is contagious. So, do not be cowed by fear. Do not be worried by name-calling. Don't be fooled by lies. Think for yourself, find the truth, and just keep doing what's right. That's it. We're all done.